What is old is new again, my friends. Tonight, we're going to party like it's in 1999, or rather, like it's 2016. Today, we're going to check out an Eastern Orthodox philosopher who is very big mad at the science world. And we'll cover a question that I thought was more or less settled 10 whole years ago. Why the scientific method doesn't use this guy's supernatural beliefs as explanations for, much of anything. We'll also cover why he wants that affirmation so bad. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today is Tuesday, April 21st, 2026. This is Roll to Disbelieve, and I'm Captain Cassidy. Thank you for joining me. This is gonna be so much fun today. We have another blast from the past, folks. I'm noticing a lot of this kind of thing happening lately. Stuff I thought Christians had figured out 10 years ago. It's still getting trotted out today like it's some kind of new, mind-blowing zinger against those mean old atheists. It's really something to see. Over at the very, very conservative blog, First Things, some guy wrote just last week about his new book. It's about how fine-tuning proves, yes, proves, that his religious beliefs are real. Yeah, fine-tuning. That creationist bullshit that we thought was dead and buried years ago? Oh no, it's not. Many times today, I have had to double-check publishing dates on my sources, because it just feels so surreal. I guess it means Christians really don't have anything new in terms of compelling support for their claims. Nothing old either, unfortunately. If they had anything, they would never shut up about it. Maybe we're just in for cycles and cycles of this stuff, just happening over and over again. New apologists rising up who've forgotten about the thrashing their predecessors got and try to reinvent the wheel. There's a sad comfort in that idea, isn't there? You know, if Christians like the guy we're talking about today just had the courage to say, okay, there's nothing real that supports my beliefs, I still have faith. You know, that would be okay. It wouldn't be a reason to convert, but it would still be okay. It would be in line with the evidence. Some of them actually do take that tack. It's admirable, but the evangelism-minded ones certainly don't. If they did that, though, it wouldn't give them a moral high horse anymore, would it? Wouldn't sell a lot of apologetics books, and it wouldn't give them an excuse for all that overreach they keep committing. I guess that's what's important to them. But before we get going on today's topic, I'd like to thank my patrons and supporters. For 13 years almost, 13 years, you have made my work possible. Thank you so much. If you'd like to join them, I welcome you as well. If you'd like to, please check out the links at the end of today's write-up, either on Patreon under Roll to Disbelieve, one word, or over at our official site at rolltodisbelieve.com. I've got options listed there for one-time gifts or longer-term support, and I appreciate whatever you decide to do. Thank you. And now, our situation report. Atheism can't answer these zingers. Ooh, but can't it though? On April 12th, Peter Weiner interviewed David Hart for the New York Times. In the interview, Hart, who is billed as, quote, an Eastern Orthodox scholar of religion, a philosopher, a cultural commentator, and a fiction writer, unquote, discusses the big problems that Christianity can't solve, Jesus's totally for real historicity, the supposed weirdness of Christianity, and, most relevantly for us, atheism's apparent inability to defend itself against Christian apologetics. Regarding atheism, Weiner asserts this, quote, the so-called new atheists are materialists, meaning they believe that all aspects of life, including consciousness, can be explained by physical, scientific processes. There's no room in their worldview for an immaterial soul. Materialists can't adequately explain how consciousness has emerged given their materialistic presuppositions. And you believe, too, referring to David Hart, that the foundation of all reality is spiritual and mental, not material, unquote. Of course, this is a straw man that Weiner is building. Those using the scientific method can't yet explain some things, but there's a reason why Weiner is blaming, quote, materialistic presuppositions for that failure, and not what's really behind it. However, Hart very obviously agrees with that mischaracterization because this is what he responds. Quote, the reason I'm not an atheist is that I think the philosophical arguments against it are unanswerable, or at least the philosophical arguments for something beyond materialism are unanswerable, unquote. By the way, if you're wondering if this guy appears to have any training in science whatsoever, that would be no. Hart goes on to complain that despite the scientific revolution's vast advances in medicine, everybody just went overboard by ignoring metaphysical causes as explanations. Now he thinks we don't have a way to incorporate his religious beliefs into anything scientific. And here's how he concludes that little section. Quote, the straightforward materialism of the new atheist, with its mechanistic prejudices, is the most self-defeating project there is. Unquote. But is it? Atheism doesn't defeat itself because it neither attacks nor defends. It doesn't bear the burden of proof. But Hart does, and he's trying his best to avoid it in this entire interview. So today, I'm going to show you what the burden of proof is, how it applies to atheism and Christianity, and why Christians like these two guys cannot shoulder that burden at all, and they kinda know it deep down. So, first, let's talk about the burden of proof. And in the write-up, there's a really good link to a pamphlet put out by a group called the High Desert Atheists. Fantastic pamphlet about the burden of proof. If somebody wants to persuade another about anything's existence, they bear the burden of proof in that exchange. So they have to provide support for that claim. Like if you don't know what the capital of Turkey is, you're in a null state about it. That's the state someone's in when a claim either hasn't been made or has not been supported in any compelling way. If I were to tell you, oh, it's Paris, you're still going to be in a null state because presumably, even if you have never thought about the capital of Turkey, you know Paris is not it. So my statement just by itself, with my assertion behind it, is not going to be compelling enough to overcome your pre-existing knowledge of where Paris is. So maybe instead I could tell you that Turkey's capital is Istanbul, and not Constantinople either, Istanbul. And you might find your belief swaying in that direction, because without a doubt, you've heard of that city. You know it's a very major one, and you know it's in Turkey, so maybe it is. But if you were to actually look up the question online, you'll find that authoritative sources say that it's Ankara, not Istanbul. So not all forms of support are compelling. If the person bearing the burden of proof fails to provide that support, then the other person remains unconvinced. It's very simple. It would be like them saying, I believe this thing, and you should too. You reply, oh, and why is that? And they say, here is why you should believe this thing that I believe. But if the other person doesn't find that compelling, then to continue shouldering the burden of proof, maybe that first person could ask what convincing support would look like in this case, and then try to provide it, or concede that it cannot be provided. Of course, in Christian conversation, that doesn't happen. At most, they'll say, ooh, I'll check into that and get back to you, and then they take a vow of silence. I don't think I have ever once heard of someone coming back and going, I looked into it and I couldn't find anything compelling. Like, I don't think it ever happens. Unfortunately, instead of just admitting that they don't have it, they would rather try to shift the burden of proof onto the people they're trying to persuade, often trying to force that other person into the weird position of defending their state of disbelief. And the thing is, in this case, there is no claim to make about the state of disbelief. Atheism is that null state for religious beliefs. So in apologetics, the burden of proof applies to Christians who are seeking to gain buy-in for religious claims. So as the null state, Atheism does not make claims, so it doesn't need to defend itself against Christian apologetics. There is literally nothing to defend. Rather, it's the folks that are making the religious claims, like David Hart here, who have to defend their own claims if they want us to believe them. Religious people may find atheism to be a disappointing mindset, sure, after their wondrous fantasies of supernatural adventures that their religion provides. Believe me, I know how disappointing it can be to go, oh wait, none of it's true. So far, that does seem to be the framework that plays most readily with the workings of reality. Whether you're disappointed with it or not, it's still true. So when Hart declares in this interview that the philosophical arguments against it are unanswerable, meaning atheism, he's dead wrong. Maybe that's why he immediately dives into apologetics wordplay about materialism. This guy could just as coherently claim that the philosophical arguments against Paris being the capital of Turkey are just unanswerable. His religious claims have just as much compelling support, which is to say, it has none. And oh, this interview is just full of Hart's uncompelling reasons for his own belief. He likes his own personal conceptualization of Jesus. Yeah, fancy that, they all do. I mean, it's just one of many developed over centuries by people specifically trying to create an ethereal God character. He doesn't understand that Christianity's origins don't look in the least supernatural. And, oh, this guy loves arguments from X, especially stuff like the argument from beauty, which runs like this. Gosh, this thing is super duper beautiful. Only a God could have made that. Therefore, Jesus. I'm simplifying it a bit, but that normally is it. From here, the interview dips into potential reality-based reasons to believe. This is where the interview reveals the depth of both of these guys' intellectual dishonesty. This interview right here, this is why we do not take science notes from theologians with no science education. But since it's a big part of why Hart thinks atheism needs to answer religious claims somehow, we'll check it out. See how helpful we are today? Hart appears to think that scientists are just way too materialist and mechanistic. Those are his words. We often see creationists and evangelicals make the same complaint. And sure, creationists are usually evangelical, but there have been some evangelical converts to Catholicism who are really creationists still. They like everything about Catholicism except obey the Pope. That's a little weird. When you hear this complaint, it's always the same. It just means that nobody involved in any legitimate science accepts Christian supernatural claims. They instead prefer explanations that are based on what can be observed and measured. And there's a reason for that preference, of course. To get to the truth about reality, science people ask questions. They predict answers via hypotheses. They test the hypotheses. They refine the questions, and they ask, and they test, and they refine over and over again. Ideally, they end up with something that accurately describes what's happening and predicts what will happen next. That is the scientific method in a nutshell. And that process cannot exist in Christianity, because Christian supernatural claims cannot be objectively described, and certainly they can't be predicted. Yeah, that's actually why I deconverted. The predictions about prayer in the Bible do not line up with reality. But worse, nothing supernatural ever, anywhere, in any religion, has ever been objectively shown to exist. For all intents and purposes, supernatural might as well mean imaginary. And it doesn't make any difference to the explanation-seeking process either way, if it exists or doesn't exist because of those limitations. So either it's irrelevant or it's non-existent. Either way, we're perfectly safe in leaving it out. It won't matter. And I think that irrelevance really bothers David Hart. He wants his own supernatural explanations to make it into the scientific method. So he tries very hard to paint these supernatural explanations as compatible with reality-based phenomena. He describes physics as not, quote, mechanistic in a comprehensive way for more than a century now, unquote. I think he's kind of talking about quantum theory. He doesn't really understand it, though, so he doesn't explain. He thinks that living cells have, quote, levels of intentionality, unquote, and that Richard Dawkins' idea of the selfish gene is something that, quote, just at the logical level fails, and says it was decades out of date when it first appeared, unquote. I don't think either one of those is the case, but whatever. In particular, Hart tries to make human consciousness itself into proof, yes, proof, of his supernatural beliefs. He is really upset that actual scientists don't reach for anything supernatural to explain or test questions that are related to human consciousness. Here's how he puts it, quote, the problem is that we're still using a model that was perfected through the exclusion of all the properties of the mental. It is impossible, using that model, to make sense of the phenomena of consciousness. So what you have to do instead is say that the phenomena of consciousness aren't real. They can be reduced to mechanical processes. The more you try to do this, the more absurd it becomes. You do end up with, say, Dennett, who said that consciousness is an illusion, unquote. And he means there, of course, Daniel Dennett, who was a much bigger name in the early 2010s as one of the original new atheists. I don't think he's been super active lately. In reality, though, consciousness can be both real and reduced to mechanical processes. Regardless of its nature, nothing about it speaks to it being supernatural. Scientists have been studying the evolution of consciousness for, quite a while now, and a lot of it is sounding really promising. Even so, we don't have all the answers about it yet. We're nowhere near that. That still doesn't mean we resort to religious explanations. It's okay not to know. That just means we have some more questioning and testing and refining to do before we do understand it. And when, not if, we do, I guarantee that the nature of human consciousness will not be the first time that some supernatural explanation has turned out to be the real one. Nope, it's going to be perfectly natural, just like every other phenomenon that once had supernatural claims circulating around it, like where the sun goes at night. We no longer believe that Apollo drives a bunch of horses who are carrying the sun. As Greta Christina wrote almost 20 years ago now, when we finally do figure out stuff that once had supernatural explanations around it, that supernatural explanation turns out to be not what's really happening. In fact, to my knowledge, not a single supernatural explanation has ever survived that process of discovery. Knowing that, it is so telling to me that the only way David Hart can make his religious claims sound better, even to himself, is to knock down the apparatus that could legitimize it if it had reality behind it anywhere. But that apparatus keeps not doing that because it just doesn't have any reality behind it. And it all makes me wonder, where did those Christian multiverse nut jobs go anyway? 'Cause they're kind of over it now, but for a hot couple of years in the mid-2010s, a lot of evangelicals latched on hard to multiverse, multiphysics apologetics. Of course, the embrace wasn't universal, and they are more or less disavowing it now anyway, but there were a few. Oh, they were so certain that the multiverse hypothesis would totally make compelling support for their religious claims. Unfortunately for them, the idea turned out to be just another little gap for their God claims to scurry into and try to hide from the big hunters of their day. I don't see those guys a whole lot anymore, but I do see a lot of Christians trying to knock down real science so the pseudoscience sounds better. They've been at it for years, at least since creationists were trying to sneak indoctrination into public science classrooms. They even used many of the same strategies. They cry, "Science needs a major conceptual revolution." They're so sure that such a revolution would, of necessity, include their supernatural framework. They think scientists have, quote, an essentially theological worldview, unquote, anyway, so they're just rejecting Christian supernatural explanations for no good reason. Oh, do you remember why they were all like, well, atheists are kind of religious too, so why don't they adopt our religious ideas? That was also a big one in the mid-2010s. We all believe shit that's not true. Why don't you join us and believe our shit instead of your shit? Maybe these things are not exactly alike. Maybe that's why to David Hart, scientists seem like big meanie heads who ignore the supernatural in their questing and testing. They're just mean. But he's wrong. It's not because they're trying to personally slight David Hart or Peter Wehner or any one of the other many Christians who need religious claims to be true. No, it's because that's where the evidence has always led. Not once has it led to anything metaphysical, to use David Hart's description, and it can't. The kind of metaphysical stuff that Hart wants to be an explanation doesn't really exist. When I said earlier we were going to talk about why there's no room for a soul in modern science, that's why. It's never been shown to exist, so it can't be part of the explanation. Claims about it can't be tested. They can't be supported. And most damningly, it doesn't really matter either way in the explanations we develop using truth-seeking processes like the scientific method. If anyone ever did discover that anything supernatural really exists, that would just snap whatever it was into natural territory. That's how it works. Either way, it wouldn't be a theologian or philosopher like David Hart making that discovery. It would be someone using the scientific method that he thinks is inadequate. Oh, and if that were ever to happen, he would glom onto it like white on rice and then never shut up about it. They would finally have something that they could use honestly to respond to atheists. But if they can't defeat atheism honestly, oh, they're happy to try to do it dishonestly. For years after I deconverted in the mid-1990s, around 93, 94, I stayed theistic in my worldview for a very, very long time. My reasoning was, just because I knew that Yahweh/Jesus wasn't real, that didn't invalidate the God claims of every other religion. It just meant that this one that I closely investigated wasn't true. So for about a decade, I was even a very dedicated, devoted pagan. But eventually, I couldn't help but notice that if I applied the same truth-seeking process to other religions that I had applied to Christianity, every one of them failed. In other words, the explanations I had adopted could not be supported through objective testing. And so gradually, just all by itself, my faith pool just drained. And as it did, those beliefs fizzled, just all by themselves. Consequently, I don't hold any supernatural beliefs today. Instead, I start with what's true and real, and then once I have that under me, I try to build my beliefs upon it. What I don't want to do is try to shoehorn reality around my pre-existing beliefs. So it's kind of weird that Hart criticizes presuppositionalism, isn't it? Oh, that's a very evangelical accusation. But if Hart, Wehner, or any of those other kind of Christians want to change the mind of someone like me, there's a way to do it. They can shoulder their burden of proof at last and take it seriously. They can utilize the scientific method and find ways to test their claims, find support for them, eliminate false and unsupported claims. But that method would never result in support for their claims, unfortunately. So instead, they're trying to invalidate the very method of truth-finding so that their own meager, inaccurate explanations sound just a little bit better. They're really hoping that we don't notice that they are implicitly admitting that they can't shoulder the burden of proof that they have. One need not wonder too long to think of a reason why, either. It's pure moral cowardice. But that's just what I expect from that crowd. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. Next up, well, we had our Alpha Course watch party this past weekend, and we are going to dive into Alpha Course number 12. It promises to teach us all how to make the most of the rest of our lives. I'm not sure if we should call the first demand it makes surprising or not at all. We'll see. That's coming up next time. Until then, this is Captain Cassidy signing off. I hope you all have a marvelous midweek, and we'll see you soon.